The power of thought. Do you know how many species of organisms are endemic? Some studies estimate that there are more than 8 million known species, and if we factor in the unknown species, the total number could be as high as 1 billion. However, out of this vast number, only one species, humans, possess the unique ability to engage in distinct thinking processes. The process of thinking involves organizing and analyzing data and information to comprehend reality. According to the Free Encyclopedia, thinking encompasses the totality of mental forms and processes that the human mind performs. These mental processes enable individuals to model the world around them, leading to more effective decision-making, goal setting, and achieving one's aspirations. Thinking can be defined as the process of providing a solution to a problem. This process involves several associated procedures, including perception, consciousness, sense, and imagination. The thought process aims to solve problems and come to conclusions through the constant movement of the mind between the known and unknown. Thinking trends can be viewed as a set of principles that guide a thinker through this process. These trends include Marxist thinking, liberalism, capitalism, atheism, Islamism, and others. Despite their differences, the intellectual cannot escape the thinking process, as these trends intersect. For example, an Islamic intellectual cannot interpret a phenomenon without linking it back to the power of God the Creator, whereas an atheistic intellectual would attribute it to nature's power, or the laws of probability. There are different patterns of thinking, such as intuitive, critical, emotional, logical, athletic, and others, which can be grouped into 4 main types: superstitious thinking, religious thinking, scientific thinking, and philosophical thinking. For instance, the phenomenon of rain can be subject to superstitious thinking and be interpreted as the tears of invisible organisms. Religious thinking is God's will. Scientific thinking as a process of condensation and precipitation of water vapor in the atmosphere. And philosophical thinking by questioning the nature of rainwater and its role in sustaining life on Earth. It is important to note that these thinking methods can overlap. For example, religious thinking does not negate scientific thinking, and philosophical thinking can be based on hypotheses that can support scientific and religious interpretations. But, superstitious thinking is generally irrational because it relies on naive and unclear principles, leading to a failure to interpret any phenomenon successfully. However, what happens when superstitious thinking is dressed in the garb of scientific or religious thinking, and becomes mainstream, popular, and sincere? Interestingly, in our everyday lives, we unconsciously use all 4 thinking methods to interpret phenomena, and come up with acceptable ideas. For instance, when we discuss the issue of inflation, we may refer to scientific economic, religious moral, philosophical cognitive, or even superstitious reasons. Throughout our lives, we use all 4 thinking methods to arrive at convictions. However, some factors can lead to misconceptions, such as rushing to judgment without proper deliberation and reasoning, letting emotions override reason, human susceptibility, intolerance of other opinions, lack of information, and selective thinking. There are many factors that can lead to a misunderstanding of reality, potentially turning it upside down. To avoid this, one must first remove the obstacles of thinking and embark on a research journey with free thinking that is not subject to haste, passion, preconceptions, intolerance, or other biases. In other words, it is necessary to eliminate the mental programming that has directed us towards a predetermined outcome that serves the programmer's goals. Such as, this programming that has led us to see trees, mountains, and other natural phenomena in a certain way. However, a recent theory introduced by a Russian researcher named Lotus challenges our traditional view. According to this theory, we actually see the world with closed eyes, as a result of rigid stereotypical thinking patterns that lead to misconceptions. From a young age, we are taught about various types of forests around the world, including tropical, temperate, and boreal forests in countries like the United States, Japan, China, Germany, Poland, Costa Rica, Australia, South America, and Africa. But what if this researcher were to tell us that there are no forests on Earth? What if they provided evidence that all the trees we know, even in Siberia, are not older than 200 years, and only 30 meters tall, making them nothing more than weeds compared to the real giant trees that we have not yet seen? Perhaps no one has allowed us to see them in order to maintain our perspective of habit, which has ultimately obscured the truth. Actually, the real giant trees existed on Earth's surface until 1920. They were a type of tree called sequoia trees. And we are fortunate that humans invented the camera before they became extinct. Images of these trees were recorded during the genocide that occurred between 1880 and 1920, and they were so enormous that they make today's trees seem like small sticks in comparison. That's not all. In the mythology of ancient civilizations, there are many stories of humans, animals, and plants turning to stone. These are not just myths, as paleontologists have discovered many fossilized remains of living organisms that have turned into stones over time, rather than decaying as is commonly known. In the United States, the Petrified Forest National Park is an open museum that displays a collection of fossilized trees, although not of the sequoia variety. Instead, they are giant silica trees that surpass the sequoia in size. However, it's possible that the Petrified Forest National Park is not a museum but rather a theater, and that the trees on display were cut down and brought to this location. If someone went to the trouble of creating this theater for silica trees that had existed for thousands of years, what would be the point? The purpose is the silica trunks on display in this museum are so small that they can't even be compared to sequoia trees. It's almost as if someone wanted humans to believe that silica trees were not giants, when in fact they may have been larger than we can imagine. Let's say someone showed you a picture of a tree being trimmed with a chainsaw, and told you it was a volcanic plateau that existed more than 200 million years ago. You might think the person was crazy, and no one would believe him. But what if he showed you a picture of Devil's Tower Mountain instead? Would you believe him? Of course you will believe him, because geologists say that Devil's Tower Mountain is from a volcanic eruption, lava, at the beginning of the Earth. However, upon closer examination, we see that the lava on the mountain is perfectly hexagonal, as if it was intelligently designed. Believing that Devil's Tower Mountain is from a volcanic eruption is like believing that a racing car was created by an explosion at the Ferrari motor plant. This is an analogy and inference made by the researcher. Now, don't lose your mind, and try to recall an image of a tree that you might have seen in your biology studies. If you examine it closely, you might realize that its internal structure is made up of hexagonal fibers. And if we were to remove the outer layers of the tree, it might look similar to Devil's Tower Mountain when viewed from above. Besides, the fibers are not adhesive, they fall freely. The fibers of this huge torso are covered with a thin outer layer, similar to the thin covering that encases the fibrous tissue above living organs. Additionally, the fibers do not stretch vertically towards the ground, but instead curve, resembling the roots of trees. This clearly indicates that the claim that the Devil's Tower is a mountain is far from the truth. Accurate observation and free thinking demonstrate that the truth is that the Devil Tower Mountain is a cut trunk of a giant silica tree, whose length can be calculated by multiplying the diameter by 20. Therefore, we discover that the length of this tree was not 30 meters like the trees we know, but 6 kilometers. Can you imagine that? Can you tear down everything you have learned and discover a fact that was deliberately hidden? Do you think this is a single example of great silica trees? Well, you have to remove the blinders from your eyes. Consider the Giant's Causeway in Ireland, another example of a region of 40,000 basalt columns formed by an ancient volcanic eruption. This is great, which means that we can also say that a corridor paved with hexagonal tiles is from a volcanic eruption. As if nobody saw how lava flows, and how it randomly hardens. The Giant's Causeway is very similar to the hexagonal composition of the Devil's Tower trunk, but it extends to the ground, suggesting that it is another trunk of a giant silica tree. Do you still think that talking about these things as stumps is nonsense, and that the Devil's Tower and the Giant's Causeway are only examples of someone cheating and hiding the reality of these trees? There are many such trees on Earth, which scientists call mesas, meaning table in Spanish, because they have a flat top like a table. They are sometimes called plateaus, but they are actually giant tree trunks that have been fossilized. There are many examples of these log-like formations in Australia, Canada, Italy, Namibia, Argentina, South Africa, the United States, Russia, Ethiopia, and Venezuela. This raises many questions and suggests that there may be something we have not yet seen, as if our minds have been programmed to see only what they want us to see, blinded to the crystal clear truth that has been hidden from us. There are hundreds of these giant trees on Earth, and it's strange that the Devil's Tower, which is a tree that is 6 kilometers high, is actually a small trunk compared to other trees. For example, the plateau in Cape Town, South Africa, is a trunk that is 3 kilometers in diameter. According to the previous equation, this means it's a trunk of a stunning 60 kilometers of silica tree. You can imagine that the branches of this tree are so huge that just one of them could create a large residential area with parks, shopping malls, and hospitals. But of course, it's hard for our minds to accept that this plateau is actually a giant tree trunk that was once 60 kilometers high and. So, the concept of apocalypse is often translated as opening the curtain, because the real world has been deliberately hidden behind a facade of habit, using universal brainwashing processes and mental programming to keep our minds captive to thinking mistakes, far from free thinking, lost in its search for truth. There is one last thing to consider before we conclude this strange search and leave this wonderland for another. We've talked about cut trees, but what about broken trees? If you compare some images of mountains with those of broken trees, you might be surprised by the similarities. Everything you see now was once part of our Earth's ecosystem, an Earth that was even more fantastic and beautiful than James Cameron portrayed in Avatar, but some people wanted to become gods and destroy everything. Despite this destruction, researchers continue to draw analogies and make inferences about what once existed. It's time to wake up and re-examine everything we've been taught in school. We need to open our eyes and minds to see the truth that has been hidden from us by those who seek to control and manipulate us. Who are these people? And why are they so intent on imprisoning our minds and restricting our thinking? And why we need to break free from the programming of our minds and engage in free and critical thinking to uncover the truth? Perhaps the answer will appear in the coming chapters.